Hey y'all, this is Brown at Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about The Lawnmower Man, the collector's edition on Blu-ray. This particular movie came out in 1992, and it was the second feature to be directed by Brett Leonard, whose first was 1989's The Dead Pit. And as far as zombie horror movies go, The Dead Pit was actually a pretty cool movie, and I would definitely recommend checking that one out. And it too is available on Blu-ray as a collector's edition as well. But whereas The Dead Pit was a low-budget horror movie, The Lawnmower Man was a comparatively higher-budgeted science fiction film, with a touch of horror here and there, but for the most part, it managed to stay within the realm of science fiction. But it had a budget of, I believe it was $10 million, and it made back a little over $32 million. So it was a modest success when at the box office, financially speaking. But critically, it was a bit more of a mixed bag. So a lot of the praise was directed towards, say, the concepts that were introduced and explored in the movie, as well as the groundbreaking computer special effects, which were rightly fully regarded as pioneering for the time in which they were made. But a lot of the criticism, though, was directed towards, say, the execution of, the plot development, as well as some of the acting. But when this movie came out on DVD as a special edition, with several bonus features being available, there were several deleted scenes that were shown to audiences for the first time. And with these deleted scenes, one got a glimpse of the movie that could have and should have been, because the deleted scenes had much in the way of plot development and character developments and character arcs as well, that basically the theatrical cut was very much lacking. And so many people, myself included, argued that if they had just left those deleted scenes in the movie, then The Lawnmower Man would have been regarded as a straight up good movie, as opposed to, say, just a guilty pleasure from the 90s. Because you watch the theatrical version, and yeah, there's definitely some cool stuff in it, but there's not much in the way of substance, and it really does come across as just a guilty pleasure. Like you go see the movie, and you're treated to some old school 90s computer special effects, which were definitely cool for the time, but with the haphazard execution of the plot development and some less than stellar acting, you basically have a guilty pleasure from the 90s with the theatrical version. But with the director's cut, you have a straight up good movie. And with the inclusion of the deleted scenes, within this movie this time, you have a far more rounded feature and a much more complete film. And with more in the way of, say, character development, you also have better acting as well. And the plot development is done at a much more deliberate pace, and the transition from, say, one set piece to another is less jarring. And so as a result, when the computer effects come on hand, they're kind of like the icing on the cake, because this time there's actually some substance, beneath the icing, as it were. But before I get into the plot, there was a bit of a connection to Stephen King with this movie, because, one, he had a short story that was also called The Lawnmower Man. And there is a scene in this movie wherein a character is killed by a lawnmower. And there is definitely a scene, there's a part in the short story that Stephen King wrote wherein a character is also killed by a lawnmower. And also there is this shadowy government organization called The Shop, which features in several Stephen King stories, but is also on hand in this movie, wherein, say, the antagonists tend to come from. And so I think, the way the movie has it, the Shop in the movie is more or less just a shout out to Stephen King. Like, it's not saying, hey, this takes place in the same universe as Stephen King stories. But basically, though, other than the shop being like a shout out, the only quote unquote connection to Stephen King was, the name of the movie being the exact same, name as that of his short story, as well as a character being killed by a lawnmower, which, I mean, in the movie it makes sense in context. But what ended up happening was, when the marketing department was, advertising for the movie, like they'd have theatrical posters and theatrical trailers, saying from the imagination of Stephen King, right? And so, Stephen King, he got wind of it, and, he eventually, like, I mean, he ended up seeing the movie eventually, and he actually liked the movie, but he's like, this has nothing to do with anything I wrote. So he basically went to court and sued for damages, and basically, got it to where, the production company, basically had to, pull, the, marketing that had anything mentioning Stephen King. So if you go on YouTube, or just anywhere online, really, you could probably find, like, one of those original trailers wherein the narrator, is saying something along the lines of "from the imagination of Stephen King," right? But then you watch the theatrical trailer, say on the DVD or the Blu-ray, it just says "from the imagination comes such and such," right? So, so yeah, that was, basically how the movie was in some way connected to Stephen King. But other than that, though, the movie is literally its own thing and has little to nothing to do with Stephen King. But other than, say, a character being killed by a lawnmower and, the shadowy government organization being called the Shop. But in the case of the latter, I honestly feel like that's more of a shout out than, say, a straight up, claim to being in the same universe as Stephen King. But, so, okay, let's go ahead and get into the plot. So, The Lawnmower Man takes place in the quote-unquote very near future, and it centers on the character of Dr. Angelo, as played by Pierce Brosnan. And Dr. Angelo is a pioneer in the realm of virtual reality software research, and he's wanting to use virtual reality to help, humanity, namely by way of, say, using virtual reality to increase one's memory or their mental capabilities. And he's initially running these tests on, say, like monkeys and stuff like that. And the organization that he works for, VSI, Virtual Space Industries, has been very accommodating with his research. But they're backed by this shadowy group called the Shop, which is a government organization that's more, say, along the lines of, looking for the next, big thing in terms of, say, military weaponry. And so they start to pressure Dr. Angelo to implement, say, combat programming into the test subjects. And Dr. Angelo, I mean, he's, against it, because he's saying, hey, we're not ready for this yet. I mean, we're just starting to get to the point of, enhancing the mental capabilities and intellect of monkeys or chimpanzees, with this, virtual reality programming, right? But the Shop is like, unless you want us to pull your funding, you're going to do what we say. So he reluctantly introduces certain pharmaceutical agents into the test subjects, which in turn interact with, say, the mental programming, which in turn results in the test subjects, being, more aggressive and, definitely more violent in this realm of, say, combat capabilities. And so it goes from, say, Dr. Angelo, using monkeys, to test out his virtual reality software, to enhance their mental capabilities, to them, becoming, say, trained soldiers almost. And so his latest test subject is a monkey that unfortunately escapes and actually manages to kill a guard on its way out. But in the process, this monkey ends up getting, hurt rather badly, by way of return fire. And it makes its way to a neighboring town and into the home, which is more of a shed, of this mentally challenged handyman named Job, who's kind of a ward of the state. And, Job is played by Jeff Fahey, by the way. But Job sees this, strangely garbed, monkey, because, this monkey, like, he still has, like, this helmet on, that allows him to, basically interact with the virtual reality, as well as, being able to, see his surroundings, but in the way of, say, combat enhanced visualizations and what have you. But this monkey, though, comes to realize that Job isn't a threat, and Job's actually trying to help the monkey, and the monkey, comes to realize this, and so basically, comes to befriend Job. And Job's actually, thinking that this, strangely, garbed monkey is one of his favorite comic book characters, named Cybo-Man, kind of come to life, right? But unfortunately, though, the shop tracks the monkey down and basically are prepared to kill it. And so Dr. Angelo is on hand, to try and get the monkey back without there being any any more bloodshed. And he knows Job because Job actually mows the majority of the lawns in the neighborhood. And so while he's simple-minded, he's very good at, say, yard care and lawn maintenance and what have you. And so Dr. Angelo, he's, talking to Job, trying to explain to him as much as he can, in a way that Job would understand what's going on. He's trying to explain that, they need to, bring the monkey back outside, because, it's in danger. It's endangering Job if it stays there. And he says he doesn't want to hurt the monkey, but neither, can they let the monkey stay with Job, because then, the people that he works for are going to see it as a threat. And so, Job, reluctantly, starts to, bring the monkey out. But unfortunately, though, the monkey, reacts adversely to, the presence of not only Dr. Angelo, but the armed soldiers, that are on hand from the shop. And so, unfortunately, the monkey, by, drawing its firearm to his perceived threat, ends up getting killed, by, the shop's, soldiers. And so, this traumatizes Job, because, mind you, he's a grown man, but he has the mind of a child, and he's, literally, has to watch, his new friend get, shot to death. And so, Dr. Angelo is also, more than a little, mortified as well, because, this test subject, this monkey, was someone that he came to see as kind of like a pet, instead of just a test subject. And, he tried to warn them that, hey, we're not ready for combat programming yet. And they just saw proof of that. But, he basically, threatens to, stop his work, as a result, because, he warned them, but they didn't listen. All they care about is, military weaponry and programming and what have you, whereas he's actually trying to help people. And so, for a time, he tries to do some further research on his own, away from the shop, but then he has an idea, because with his technology being meant to enhance mental capabilities, he has the notion that maybe if he uses some of his software on Job, or someone like Job, then that might be a step in the right direction, but say avoiding at the same time the combat pharmaceutical cocktail that the shop was having him use on the monkey, which in turn interacted with the virtual reality programming. So basically Dr. Angelo talks to Job and explains to him that he has some programs and games that actually might help make him smarter. And Job, mind you, while he is mentally challenged, I mean, he's not entirely unaware of how the world treats him, because I mean, the one other friend he has is is a guy who works with him, a guy named Terry, who the two of them work together in terms of, say, taking care of the lawns in the neighborhood. And Terry's actually the brother of this priest, who's named Father McKean, who's basically raised Job as a ward of the state for several years. But unfortunately, Father McKean is a rather abusive individual and takes out a lot of his frustration on Job. And Job, being the simple-minded individual that he is, he basically can't bring himself to resist whenever Father McKean beats him, because he's thinking that he deserves to be punished, like he has the mind of a kid, right? But he's reflecting on his life and everything, and other than Terry, Father McKean's brother, and Job's co-worker, there's like one other person in the neighborhood that's a friend of his, and it's a kid named Peter, who, the two of them, struck up a friendship over them both liking comic books. And so sometimes, Job and Terry will bring Peter along with them on their routes, when the two of them are mowing lawns and what have you. But basically, Job, though, I mean, other than those two people, he doesn't really have any other friends, because everyone else seems to make fun of him or just, dismisses him as an idiot, because of his, diminished mental capabilities. And so when Dr. Angelo comes along and, shows him some of the virtual reality stuff, like, these flying virtual reality games, and when he's explained to Job that, he has games like that could make him smarter, Job, basically, jumps at the chance. And, so Dr. Angelo explains to him that, okay, so we're going to be working in my house, but you can't tell anyone, what we're doing, because if the wrong people found out about it, then, they might try and, take the tools that I'm using and use them to hurt you, which is basically what happened to, the monkey test subject. And so naturally, Dr. Angelo isn't wanting Job to get hurt, but at the same time, he has an opportunity here to see if his original programming will actually work on a human, as in, the programming that was devoid of, say, combat capabilities. So he begins to run a series of experiments, on Job, like a few injections here and there of some pharmaceutical agents, and then he basically has him play with some of the virtual reality games, which start to enhance Job's mental capabilities. And so while Dr. Angelo's witnessing this gradual progress, Job's starting to see a difference in himself as well. He starts to become more aware of, say, him, like his thought processes, and say how how people perceive him, and he starts to say stand up for himself when, say, people try and bully him, or he tries to say clean himself up, because prior to these experiments, he looked like a vagrant almost. I mean, a friendly vagrant, but a vagrant nonetheless. And so once he starts to play these virtual reality games and take these drugs that Dr. Angelo is injecting him with, basically he starts to become a whole new person. And not only is he smarter, but he becomes more confident as well. And so he also starts to absorb information at an astronomical rate. And it starts to carry over, to a point of, say, like if he starts to, listen to music, he'll go through, say, a couple of seconds of several songs on a CD, and then he'll throw the CD aside because it's like, he's listened to all he needs to listen to it, because, with those few seconds of each song he listens to, basically, he's heard all he needs to hear of each song. And then, Dr. Angelo also introduces him to, courses in history, and he goes through, say, decades worth of history in just a couple of days, and so this virtual reality stuff, is really having an impact on him, and a positive one too. And he also strikes up a romance with this lady who's a widow in the neighborhood. Let's see, her name was Marnie Burke, and like I said, she's a widow in the neighborhood, and Job ends up striking up a romance with her because of his newfound mental capabilities. I mean, he's he's smart enough to realize that she's interested in him, and the two of them strike up a romance. And so things seem to be looking up for Job. But then he starts to realize that this programming is changing him, and so is Angelo. And so Angelo figured that there were going to be some crazy side effects, or at the very least unforeseen side effects, such as Job being able to pick up everything he needs to from a song from just a few seconds, as well as being able to breeze through decades worth of history in just a day or two. But Job also starts to be able to read people's minds, and this is something that basically scares him, and it's something that he's not ready for. And also he finds himself being able to move things with his mind. And so things are starting to get more intense, which is when the shop rears its ugly head once more. And it turns out that the shop, they've been keeping tabs on Dr. Angelo this whole time. So even though Dr. Angelo tried his best to keep his research underground, as in his research with Job, the shop's been following him this whole time. And one of its agents, a guy named Timms, who's basically the shop liaison, between the shop and Dr. Angelo, he's basically been the one who's been spying on Dr. Angelo and reporting back to the shop. And when he reports that Job's manifesting, telekinetic abilities, as well as, mind reading capabilities, the head of the shop, instructs Timms to basically, switch out the pharmaceutical agents that Dr. Angelo is using for, say, combat enhancing agents. And so, he does so without Dr. Angelo knowing. And so whenever he's been, continuing these experiments, with these pharmaceutical agents, he doesn't realize that he's, exposing Job to these combat enhancing agents. And as a result, whenever, Job is basically in the realm of virtual reality, with the technology at VSI, whenever he's like got the helmet on and everything, the programming becomes much more aggressive, and he starts to not only absorb information at a far faster rate than Dr. Angelo anticipated, but he starts to take on a more aggressive demeanor, and his mind reading capabilities and telekinetic abilities basically go off the charts, and he starts to see himself as a new life form, and he basically wants to become this god, of virtual reality, something that bridges the gap between humanity and virtual reality. And unfortunately, though, this means, shutting, Dr. Angelo out, because, Dr. Angelo is trying to tell him, something's wrong, something went very wrong, things are going much too fast, and you're absorbing, far more information, in power, than one man was ever meant to have. And he doesn't know what the shop's done, but, he knows something's wrong. But, Job is, basically, telling him, it's out of your hands now, and he explains that, basically, he's going to upload his consciousness, into, the mainframe, and his, birth cry as a new life form will be the sound of every phone on the planet ringing in unison. And as far as, the people pulling, Dr. Angelo's strings, he knows, because of his, newfound powers, he's aware of what the shop's, doing and what the shop has made him, after they've manipulated Dr. Angelo's research. But, he's willing to take the fight to them. But he also uses his newfound powers, to lash out at, people in the neighborhood who have abused him, such as, Father McKean and, a couple of people that have bullied him. And so, basically, he's become a killer at this point. And so, you have the shop, pursuing him because, they're wanting to use him, for, their purposes in the military industrial complex. And you have Dr. Angelo pursuing him because he's trying to, save Job from, becoming, a monster, as it were. Whereas, Job, he literally sees himself as, on the verge of becoming, not only a new life form, but a god, a cyber god, as it were. And so, yeah, this was a very, fascinating movie. And as I mentioned, with, the director's cut, it's actually a good movie. And for the record, this, this plot I'm describing it mainly pertains to the director's cut. Like the the bit with the escaped monkey. I mean, that was in the director's cut. It wasn't really in the theatrical version. Like, it was touched upon, but you didn't really see it developed until you saw the director's cut. But I mean, you really what you have here is basically Flowers for Algernon, but with virtual reality thrown in, as well as the horror of corrupt human nature thrown in as well. But because you see this simple-minded individual, Job, basically become a much smarter individual, but which, I mean, initially it's seen as a good thing, in the movie, both from the audience's perspective as well as from, say, those around Job within the movie. But then when he starts to display these wondrous capabilities such as telekinesis and mind reading, and this is before the shop gets involved, like in terms of, say, switching out the pharmaceutical agents. There's already an element of tension there, because we're like, okay, him being smarter is one thing, and him being more confident is, it's good and everything, but him being able to read minds and him being able to absorb information, just like that. I mean, that's where, and the whole telekinesis thing, of course, I mean, that's where we're like, okay, we're in uncharted territory here. We need to slow down. But unfortunately, with the shop rearing its ugly head, I mean, that's when, we go from, okay, we're going into uncharted territory to, oh crap, now we build a monster. So it's like, imagine, Charlie from Flowers for Algernon, becoming like a Frankenstein monster. And that's kind of what you have with the Lawnmower Man. And I have to say, like, with the director's cut, the performances are much better this time around. But the main actor who carries this movie is Jeff Fahey, because he plays Job in such a wonderful way. Like, he really goes all out in terms of, say, playing a mentally challenged individual, both in terms of, say, like his wardrobe and everything, but also like his physical mannerisms, and so he's like, you really believe that he's a child in a man's body, right? But then once he starts to take part in Dr. Angelo's experiments, you see him gradually start to grow intellectually, and to a point where you see him becoming more aware of things like his surroundings and how people perceive him, and like he starts to become more confident in everything, and so you see him gradually start to stand up for himself, and also start to become more, I guess, grateful for these newfound gifts and opportunities, as it were. And so it's like we're happy for Job, because of how Jeff Fahey plays the part. But then when he starts to become more of a Frankenstein's monster with the shop's interference, Jeff Fahey goes from a likable individual to someone who is increasingly scary to be around. And Jeff Fahey does such a good job of, say, on one hand making us scared of his character, scared of Job, once his dark side starts to run the show, due to the shop's interference, and his newfound powers becoming much more violent. It's like we're definitely in fear of Job, but at the same time, though, I mean, there are moments where we do sympathize with him, such as when he uses his newfound powers to punish those who have harmed him. And even when those punishments go in the realm of, say, murder or something like that, we understand why he's doing it, though, because, these were people who, kicked him when he was down, when he was just, poor, mentally challenged Job, right? I mean, these are people who, kicked him when he was down. These are people who took advantage of him, and so when, on one hand, when he's initially just standing up for himself, when, prior to the shop interfering with, Dr. Angelo's work, I mean, we're proud of him. But once the shop interferes with him, and thus, his powers, take on a darker turn, it becomes a lot more, disturbing, because, we sympathize with him, because, he's, lashing out at those who have hurt him. But at the same time, he's doing so in such a way where, he's basically killing them. And so it's, we sympathize with him, but at the same time, we're terrified of him as well. And Jeff Fahey just does such a good job of, being able to, have that character arc, and he plays Job, in such, a believable way, from point A to point B to point C. So it's like we never lose our sympathy for him, but at the same time, there comes a point where we realize that he is a danger now, and someone needs to stop him. And so, it's like when he goes into the territory of, in his own words, becoming a cyber Christ. I mean, Dr. Angelo is trying to talk him down, saying, you're experiencing a Christ complex. Anyone who has this much power, one of the first signs that they go through is, the delusion. One of the first things that they go through and experience is a Christ complex, because no one was meant to have this level of power, but of course, Job, I mean, yeah, it's just when he's, talking about how he's going to, announce his birth cry, I mean, as a new life form by making every phone on the planet ring at the same time, we believe him. And just because of Jeff Fahey's delivery, because at this point, he's become like this, cold, almost machine, that has flashes of anger and pain, but at this point is a machine that's determined to fulfill its purpose. And so seeing, Jeff Fahey, play Job in such a way, to where, he starts off one way and then gradually becomes something more sinister. I mean, it's such a gradual transition, to where we buy it. And I think that, I mean, Jeff Fahey, of course, I remember him from movies like Silverado or Machete. He usually plays a bad guy, right? And I know he was in a horror movie called Body Parts. I still need to see that one. But this is probably my favorite performance of his, simply because of the range of human emotions that he goes through and the transition from, one type of personality, to another, to a point where the dark side gradually takes over. I mean, it's such a good performance. Excuse me. So yeah, Jeff Fahey definitely carries the movie as far as acting goes. But Pierce Brosnan, though, definitely shines as far as, how Dr. Angelo is depicted. And, with the theatrical version, I mean, he was okay, but with the director's cut, there's a lot more given to his character. And as a result, I mean, Dr. Angelo comes across as a lot more sympathetic as opposed to, say, manipulative. Because in the theatrical version, without certain scenes being in place, Dr. Angelo comes across as someone who's basically, manipulating Job, just for the sake of being able to continue his experiments, but with the director's cut, though, with the shared trauma of, his test subject, the monkey, being killed, traumatizing both Job and himself. We really see that Dr. Angelo is someone who believes in what he's doing, and he's not just after a patent. Like, he really does believe, that his technology, if used correctly, if implemented correctly, and if, worked on at a gradual pace, he believes that it can help humanity. And, that compassion that he has, for humanity really comes to the forefront, with Pierce Brosnan's performance. And, it's definitely something that you see, much more clearly in the director's cut, because he's a scientist who's trying to do good for the world. And so when he, asks Job, if he wants to, be a part of this, on one hand, he sees an opportunity, because this is, someone who could genuinely benefit, from the virtual reality experiments that Dr. Angelo has. Like, this is someone who is a mentally stunted individual who could theoretically benefit from having his intellect enhanced by Dr. Angelo's virtual reality experiments. And so instead of, unlike in, the theatrical cut, where, Dr. Angelo just sees him as the perfect opportunity to just continue his work. I mean, yes, we still, get the idea that he sees Job as an opportunity, but he also sees Job as someone who could genuinely benefit from his work. And so in the director's cut, Dr. Angelo just comes across as much more benevolent and less manipulative. And also, I really liked how, Pierce Brosnan, he, much like how Job goes from, one point to another in terms of, character, development, we really see how Dr. Angelo, on one hand, he shares, the joy that Job's experiencing from his newfound intellect, because, Dr. Angelo, when he sees this, he realizes that his experiments are working. But once, the side effects of mind reading and telekinesis come into play, that's when, he tries to be more responsible and say, okay, we need to slow things down here, Job. But unfortunately, though, when the shop, basically, sweeps the rug, pulls the rug out from under him and starts to, expose Job to the combat enhancing, side of things, we share Dr. Angelo's horror, at what's happening to Job, because, I mean, he sees, Job, who's a kind-hearted individual, gradually becoming a monster. And, we, share, Dr. Angelo's desperation in trying to get through to Job and say, hey, something's wrong here. Because, I mean, up to a certain point, he's not aware that the shop's, done what it's done, to his work. Like, he just thinks that, his own experiments, by themselves have gotten out of control, and so, we understand why he's wanting to, bring Job back in and stop the experiments. But, at this point, it's too late, though. So, I mean, Pierce Brosnan, I think does a really good job in the part, and, his character comes across as, much more nuanced than, say, the theatrical version. And so, once again, this director's cut, really, comes through in terms of, say, enhancing, certain characters. And also, I really liked seeing Jenny Wright. She was one of the main characters, one of the main vampires in the movie Near Dark, and it was really cool seeing her here. And she didn't have a whole lot to do, but she plays the widow that Job ends up forming a relationship with. And Jenny Wright is just she has such a natural aura of sensuality in this movie, to where it's like when she and Job hit it off, I mean, it really comes across as organic chemistry. Unfortunately, though, in real life, for one reason or another, Jenny Wright stopped acting after this movie, and she more or less retired from acting. It's a pity though, because like even in the relatively brief amount of time she's on screen in this movie, she makes her character very memorable in terms of, say, just how sensual she is, and her developing romance with Job, was something that was nice to see, simply because she and Jeff Fahey, both had really good chemistry with each other. It's a bummer that Jenny Wright stopped acting after this, but she did a nice job in this movie with her part as the sexy widow. But we also have two wonderful character actors in this movie. We have Jeffrey Lewis, who was in movies like Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, and the miniseries Salem's Lot. He tended to act with Clint Eastwood a lot back in the day, but he plays Terry McKean, the brother of Father McKean, and Terry, of course, as I mentioned, was one of the few friends that Job had. And so, Terry, he kind of comes across as like, a surrogate uncle to Job, trying to look out for him as much as he can. And basically, it's like he's sort of like a surrogate uncle, and also, a genuine best friend to Job. And, Jeffrey Lewis, I mean, he tends to play characters that, are maybe not, the sharpest tool in the shed sometimes, but, at the end of the day, though, I mean, they've got a really good heart, and they definitely are altruistic individuals, at least from the stuff I've seen them in, but so seeing him play that type of character here was very endearing to see, because, he has really good chemistry with Jeff Fahey. And when Jeff Fahey's playing Job as, the mentally, challenged individual, and then gradually transitioning to someone who's more, mentally sharp and aware of things, it's interesting seeing how Jeffrey Lewis's character, how Terry, reacts to all this, because, when he's, with Job, when Job's like, say, in his intellectually stunted, mindset and mental state, Terry's, very compassionate and kind of like almost like a Papa Bear at times, in a sense that he tries to look out for him. But then when, Job starts to become smarter and starts to, say, become more confident and stand up for himself and stuff, you see how proud, Terry is of him. And we sees that, there's like a mutual attraction between, Job and, the widow. He's like, go get her. So it was really nice to see that, like someone who, like, I mean, there were a lot of people that treated Job like shit in this movie. And so seeing like this one guy, actually, give a damn about him and, have his back the whole way through. I mean, it's nice to see that kind of character, in a movie like this, in a sense that most of the other characters are, mean to Job. I mean, with the exception of Dr. Angelo, in a sense that, while he is, working with Job, as an experiment, he actually does care about Job. But then again, Jeffrey Lewis, as Terry, really comes across as someone who has Job's back and is a true friend. So the other character actor that stands out is Jeremy Slate, and he plays Father McKean, and he was also in Brett Leonard's first movie, Dead Pit, and he had a prominent role in that movie as well. But Jeremy Slate, though, I mean, he was in a whole bunch of westerns back in the day. If I remember correctly, he was also in the original True Grit with John Wayne. But anyway, he plays Father McKean, and whereas his character's brother Terry is basically, you know, a surrogate uncle and best friend to Job. You know, Father McKean is an evil SOB. Like, he's a very abusive individual. And you get the idea that, you know, the only reason, you know, he, you know, took Job in all those years ago as a ward was, you know, there might have been some sort of tax write-off for the church or something like that. I mean, it doesn't go into that much detail, but from what you see, though, I mean, or maybe you kind of get the idea it's either maybe it was something along those lines, or maybe at one point in time he did care about Job, but then as time went on, you know, he starts to see Job as someone that he can just use as a whipping boy anytime he's upset about something. And basically he's someone who you find out as the movie goes on is, you know, a very hypocritical individual who has his own skeletons in the closet that are only hinted at, but it's enough to where you realize that, you know, this guy, you know, in a position of a spiritual leader is a very, you know, bad person. And so, you know, seeing you know, Jeremy Slate, you know, play this type of character, I mean, it's not the first time he's played a bad guy, you know, but seeing him play this type of bad guy, like someone who's in a position of spiritual authority but is abusing, you know, their, you know, power, you know, over someone who is, you know, basically a child. I mean, they're physically an adult, but mentally they're a child. I mean, you hear about stuff like this happening a lot, you know, not just with the church, but, you know, in other, you know, organizations as well. But I mean, it comes across as something that, you know, some people might say that it's anti-Catholic or something like that. But I just think that, I mean, it's like a reminder that, you know, there are people who, you know, use religion as a shield, you know, to do whatever it is, you know, they feel like when it comes to, say, abusing other people, or abusing those who are quote unquote beneath them. And unfortunately, I mean, in this movie, we definitely see that with how Father McKean, you know, treats Job. And, you know, Jeremy Slate, I mean, in real life, I mean, like, I've seen a couple of interviews with him, and he really comes across as a, you know, nice guy in real life, but he does such a good job of playing, like, a bad, you know, character, like a bad person, you know, to where it's like we're in fear for, you know, Job's well-being initially, you know, prior to, you know, his intellect being enhanced. But like when he starts to stand up for himself against Father McKean, I mean, it's cathartic. But, you know, at the same time, though, when, you know, Father McKean ends up on Job's hit list, you know, when, you know, he's, you know, dealing with certain people in a rather permanent way, I mean, we're actually not that upset to see, you know, Father McKean gets just desserts. And so Jeremy Slate, you know, did a good job of making us, you know, hate his character. But we also have, you know, Dean Norris, Hank Schrader himself from Breaking Bad, playing the director of the shadowy government organization, the Shop. And he actually does a pretty good job of, you know, playing, you know, a cold, you know, calculating individual, you know, who, you know, is, you know, straight up evil, you know, and is in a position of power. And he doesn't have like a huge part to play, but when we see him on screen, though, we understand, we buy the fact that, you know, his is the character that's pulling the strings. And I'm so used to seeing Dean Norris play, you know, someone who's, you know, kind of rowdy, you know, like Hank Schrader, but seeing him play this, you know, cold, sinister type of character was kind of a revelation for me. And as brief of a part as he had, I mean, it was a memorable one, I thought. But let's see, what else have we got? Also, I liked the child actor, or I should say then child actor, Austin O'Brien, who plays Peter. the neighborhood kid that befriends Job, and the two of them, they share a love of comic books and what have you. And if I remember correctly, I think Austin O'Brien was also in the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie Last Action Hero. But as far as child actors, I mean, of the 90s, Austin O'Brien was actually pretty good in my opinion. And here, I really liked his friendship with Job, because I mean, here he is. I mean, he's a kid, and his mom and dad, are unfortunately are in a tumultuous relationship. Like the father's very abusive, and the mom's afraid to try and get out of it. And unfortunately, Peter is oftentimes a victim of his father's abuse. And so whenever he hangs out with Job and Terry, it's kind of like an escape for him, because it's like he gets to ride with these cool guys in their truck, and see how machinery works, like with lawnmowers and stuff like that, and talk about comic books with Job. And it's really nice to see that even though Job is at this point like an intellectually diminished individual, I mean, he's someone who genuinely sees Peter as a friend. And even when he's like not quite mentally on the ball, like say prior to Dr. Angelo's experiments, he still tries to stand up for Peter at certain points, which is nice to see. But yeah, I mean, Austin O'Brien as Peter, did a nice job. And unlike say other child actors in certain movies, like he never comes across as annoying. Like he comes across like a real kid, and not a cutesy wootsy kid, but just like an ordinary kid. And it's just in a tough situation, and has a brief amount of time where he's able to escape from the situation by way of hanging out with Job and Terry, but he also starts to pick up on certain things, like say when Job starts to get smarter, he starts to pick up on that. And so it's interesting seeing how like a little kid reacts to something like that. And even say when Job starts to become a quote unquote monster, Peter never gives up on his friend. Like he, even when Job's at his darkest, like he tries to reach out to him and save his friend. And so I guess that's where the innocence of childhood comes into play, because even though he's in a tough situation with his abusive father, I mean, he's not letting that darkness, he's not letting that darkness diminish the fact that he has a friend in Job. And regardless of how sinister Job is becoming, it's nice to see that Peter doesn't lose faith in him and is going to try and get through to him. So I mean, it's pretty cool to see that from a child actor. So yeah, I mean, as far as like the acting goes, I mean, those were the performances I think that stood out to me. And certain other characters or certain other actors get more time to shine because they have more to do with the director's cut. Like case in point, Colleen Coffey, she plays Dr. Angelo's wife, and there's a certain plot development that comes into play in the director's cut, wherein it's like in the theatrical version, she just comes across as a witch with a B who has no faith in her husband's work. And then she just kind of storms out, and that's the last you see of her. And you get the impression that she just, bailed on her husband. But in the director's cut, though, there's an interesting plot development where we see her being manipulated by Job into becoming sort of a Stepford wife for Dr. Angelo. And that's kind of one of the elements that adds to the horror of things. That's where Dr. Angelo's like, this is, I've created a monster, as in, something's happened to Job, and, something along those lines, and so it's like I said, I mean, certain actors have more to do in this director's cut, and she was definitely, one of the people that kind of benefited from that. So she didn't have a huge part in either version, but in the director's cut, she definitely had a more memorable part, and that's for sure. I also really like the special effects in this movie, and I realized that things have come a long way in between, say, 1992 and now in terms of, say, computer special effects, but especially for the time, though, I mean, these were very groundbreaking. Like the virtual reality sequences, some of them kind of look like, say, a cross between Space Invaders and Minecraft, like some of the combat simulations that you see at the very beginning through the, test through the monkey's eyes when he's being subjected to virtual reality experiments. But also, we also see like these computer games, like these flight simulations, which are really awesome to see. Like when Job and Peter are in Dr. Angelo's workshop or makeshift workshop, with these virtual reality helmets on and these chairs, that are kind of like flat and they're kind of hunched over like this. But it's like you see it, from their perspective, and it's like they're flying, through this, wondrous landscape of virtual reality, and it's really good special effects, for the time, and it's still kind of like a wow moment, and also, like whenever, Job is, like there's this really cool scene involving, cyber sex, which, you've probably seen, clips of, like in, computer animation films like The Mind's Eye or something like that. But there's this really memorable scene where, Job, takes, the widow, he takes Marnie, to the facility, where, the virtual reality research is done at VSI, and he has her, connected to one virtual reality headset, and he's got one on him, and basically you see the two of them, basically on this virtual reality landscape in these sort of liquid bodies almost, and like you see their virtual forms having sex, and as they meld together, they sort of become like this almost dragonfly-like creature that flies across the landscape. And it's a really cool scene, and it's very imaginative of what virtual reality could offer us. And and it's ironic that was like the first time, I think, that the concept of cyber sex was shown on screen, if not one of the first times, right? But also, like the climax, when we see Job fully immerse himself in virtual reality and become like a new life form in this virtual landscape. I mean, there's a bit of an uncanny valley look to it, but at the same time, though, for the movie, it just works because we see that Job has abandoned his organic body to a point where it's almost dust, and has put his consciousness into virtual reality and formed a new body for himself. And when he says in this ominous voice, I am God here, I mean, it really adds to the power of the scene. So it's kind of a combination of Jeff Fahey's voice acting, granted kind of distorted, right? But same time, his lines of dialogue, and then you see this visual special effect of his body being reborn. I mean, it's pretty cool stuff. I mean, it's scary, but it's awesome at the same time. And when you see Angelo at the climax, trying to get into this virtual landscape to try and stop him one more time, that's where you have like this cyber battle, wherein you see Angelo's character as this sort of like, he almost looks like a T-1000, the silver T-1000 form from Terminator 2 almost, but it's like much smaller than, Job's, giant, form in this virtual landscape. And you see the two kind of squaring off with one another. But it's really good animation, especially for the time. Now of course there is a scene or two that looks kind of dodgy. Like there's a scene involving this virtual army of bees that Job is able to bring into the real world to, charge, the soldiers of the shop. Which, I mean, in concept, it's pretty cool, but you see it on screen, it's like, okay, that looks dated, right? And there's also like a moment where, they tried to go with more practical effects, I guess, in terms of showing, Job's body decaying, and it just looks really fake, unfortunately. And that's probably like, I think, the one quote-unquote bad special effect I could think of. Because there's another use of practical effects earlier in the movie where, Job, tries to, convince his body that his hand's burning, sort of like, doing a mind over matter experiment. And you see, this, blister just, gradually, come up on his hand. And I think that was like a practical effect. I don't think that was CGI, but like that was actually a good practical effect. And it was something that added to, Job's, depiction, the depiction of Job's increasing, powers, and not quite at the point where he's becoming a monster, but like, okay, we're in uncharted territory here. But then, you get to the part where, his body literally just crumbles, after his consciousness goes into virtual reality at the climax. I mean, that's where the practical effect, looked really lame and fake. So, I mean, for the most part, the special effects in this movie are pretty cool. I mean, and dated, yes, but still really cool for the time. But they definitely add to the, science fiction feel of the movie and add that otherworldly touch. But also, I really liked, the soundtrack, the music. It was composed by a guy named Dan Wyman. It's W-Y-M-A-N. I hope I'm saying his name right. But it's a very atmospheric score. I mean, sometimes it's very, it's very, how should I say it? Optimistic at times and innocent sounding, like very vibrant. In some respects, it kind of reminded me of the Tangerine Dream score from Legend. Like whenever, Lily's in the woods in that movie, or Lily and Jack are in the woods or something like that. It has that kind of feel. Not quite the same sound, but it has that feel of innocence, But like when we're seeing Job being introduced and, seeing, his character for the first time, there's that sort of innocent sounding, score, where it's like, something like a little kid, would be associated with. And since Job's like a child in a man's body, I mean, it makes sense. But then, of course, when you have, anything to do with, say, like the shop, or say, Job's, power taking on a more ominous, tone, the music takes on a more ominous and, mechanical tone. And so it's really, cool how it goes from, say, one emotional extreme to another. And it does so in such a way to where the transition's never jarring. But yeah, so I mean, really good soundtrack by Dan Wyman. And the end credits, the music at the end credits I thought was really neat too, because it was kind of a combination of, I guess you could say, hopeful, and scary at the same time. It's just a good balance. But I also liked the production design by Alex McDowell, because like when it comes to, say, how the VSI facilities are depicted. I mean, they have this, cold, sort of, soulless look to them, as far as, say, how a government-run research facility might look, and certain, if, say, this government branch was run by someone as evil as the shop. There's a very ominous tone, to a lot of the machinery there. But also, though, like when it comes to, say, how the town's depicted and everything, it's kind of like a snapshot of a Norman Rockwell drawing or something like that. So it was kind of an interesting balance between, say, an innocent looking town right next to this cold and mechanical soulless facility that's run by the shop, or technically it's VSI, but they're run by the shop too. So interesting, it was good, good use of production design, and the camera work and the photography I thought were also nicely done as well. They were done by a guy named Russell Carpenter, and like with the way the camera work's done, I mean, I'm not a technical whiz or anything like that, but just how the camera's used in certain shots, like you see certain perspective shots, or you also see how certain sets are lit, and it kind of adds to the emotional qualities of certain scenes. And I thought that the photography was just very well done. But yeah, all in all, though, I think that this was a cool movie. And I just really wish that the director's cut is what was shown in the theaters originally, because like I said earlier, I think that had that been the case, the Lawnmower Man would have been regarded as a good science fiction movie from the 90s, as opposed to just, say, a guilty pleasure from the 90s, which what the theatrical version was, right? But with this director's cut, this was a good sci-fi film from the 90s. This is the good sci-fi film from the 90s that should have been. But also, one of the special effects groups, that did the computer animation was called Angel Studios. And I know that there was other, special effects groups as well that were involved, but I think the stuff that was pointed out, like in the commentary that was, pointed out that was done by them, some of this stuff was really cool, especially for the time, like the flying sequences and what have you, and the virtual reality landscape. I mean, great stuff. So, I'm hoping that they're still in business today. Maybe they've gone to bigger and better things, but hopefully they're still kicking, right? But yeah, real quick before I sign off here. So there's 2 discs, right? So the theatrical cut is on disc 1, and you also have a good portion of the bonus features on disc 1. You have Cyber God, Creating the Lawnmower Man, and it has interviews with director Brett Leonard, actor Jeff Fahey, and several other people that were involved, both as far as, say, like acting, as well as various behind the scenes people. And you also have an audio commentary with Brett Leonard and co-writer and producer Jamil Everett. And you also have deleted scenes, original electronic press kit with cast interviews and behind-the-scenes footage, edited animated sequences, TV spot, and theatrical trailer. So disc 2, that's where the director's cut is. It's a new 4K scan of Inner Positive with additional director's cut footage from the original camera negative. Basically, I think what that's saying is, the visual quality is punched up, but also the deleted scenes were, added back into the movie to make it a complete movie, But you also have an audio commentary with Brett Leonard and Jamil Everett. Jamil Everett was, the producer and a co-writer, and she was also Brett Leonard's, romantic partner at the time. And then, they became friends, but they still were, production partners and what have you. You also have conceptual art and design sketches, behind the scenes and production stills, and storyboard comparison. But I will say that, so I watched the Cyber God documentary on disc 1, and that was a very informative documentary. And it's fascinating seeing, certain players in the movie, like say Jeff Fahey, as he was then, and then seeing him, as he was, quote unquote now, as in when this documentary was made. And you can tell a lot of times passed. He's older and everything, but it's a role that, as Gob is definitely a role that he's very proud of, and it's one of his favorite roles. And you kind of get a neat perspective on his time working on the movie, but you also find out a bunch of other stuff about the movie. Like there's a story that Brett Leonard recounts in both the documentary and the commentaries, where he talks about how when Pierce Brosnan and Jeff Fahey got the parts, Brett Leonard and a few other people, they took them to a pub to celebrate, right? And Brett Leonard was given a card by the studio, like a credit card, right, to cover the bill, right? And he's thinking, okay, yeah, no problem. Well, here's the thing. So Pierce Brosnan and Jeff Fahey were both Irish, right? And Irish people tend to like to drink, and so when they got to the pub, they were drinking these little shot glasses of port, right? And thing is, each one of those was like $80, and they were drinking several of them. And so, Brett Leonard didn't know that, each one of those was $80 until he got the bill. And so he literally had to, drive home to, get more cash, because the stuff that was on the credit card didn't quite cover that. So he said this in both the documentary and the commentary track. So he's like, that's the first time, that's when I learned you don't take an Irish guy out drinking, let alone two. So, that was a story that I thought was pretty funny, that, one that stood out for sure. But yeah, like, as far as the commentary tracks go, I didn't listen to the one for the theatrical cut, but I listened to the one for the director's cut. And I get the impression that they're both two different tracks. It's not just, a few things added here and there, but in the director's cut, they specifically talk about the director's cut. Brett Leonard and Jamil Everett do. And sadly, Jamil Everett passed away not that long ago. But, she sounds like someone who, was a good partner for Brett Leonard, both, say, personally and professionally. But, you learn a lot of stuff about, the making of the movie, and stuff that they, were able to pull off successfully, and other things that, they wish they could have done better, but also, how they did certain things in the movie, like certain shots or certain, bits of character development and what have you. And one of the things that they joke about is how, there were several times in the movie they tried to make Pierce Brosnan not look like Pierce Brosnan, as in they tried to dirty him up, make him not look so sexy, because this is Pierce Brosnan. And, it wasn't that long ago that he had been doing Remington Steele, right? And so this is, post Remington Steele, but pre Goldeneye. So this is Pierce Brosnan kind of in his prime. And, they're trying to make him, look more rugged and what have you, or they're trying to underlight him, I think was the term. Like, have the lighting to where, maybe it wasn't so, bright, or, it was more in shadow. But regardless of what they did, Pierce Brosnan still looked like Pierce Brosnan. Like, he still looked good, And so they're like, okay, we give up. so I thought that was nice. That was a funny little story too, But so you find out some, fun stuff like that. Also, another thing you find out, I found out from the commentary, was that, I think they touched on it in the documentary too, but they went into more detail in the commentary. But in the contraption that they use at VSI for the virtual reality tests, like there's this. It's like this sphere contraption where a person gets in and they sort of spin around, and they have these virtual reality helmets on, and like they're able to, say, move their arms and legs while the contraption's, spinning around. And the whole theory, the whole idea is, while the contraption's spinning, like, they're able to move their arms and legs and interact with whatever's in virtual reality, whatever they're seeing and feeling, right, in virtual reality. But these contraptions, though, only a couple of the actors were able to, work with them without getting motion sickness, because, like, Jenny Wright, she was only able to be in this contraption for just a few minutes, like during the cybersex scene. So, like, when you see, her and Jeff Fahey in their contraptions, like, it cuts from them to the virtual reality landscape and their virtual bodies making love and all that. But in the scenes with her, though, she's only in there for just a couple of minutes, because in real life, she was only able to do it for a minute or two before getting sick. And so, they kind of had to put a stunt woman in there at a certain point and, use, like, close-ups of Jenny Wright's face, to make it look like she was still in there, so, but yeah, a little tidbit. But yeah, so all in all, though, the Lawnmower Man, the collector's edition, I mean, the director's cut, good movie, and the collector's edition, it's definitely the way to go as far as, how to experience the movie with, all its glory, So I'm going to go ahead and give The Lawnmower Man, the collector's edition, 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good movie. The director's cut, if you watch this movie, 1, go with the collector's edition, and 2, watch the director's cut, if you want to see the movie at its best. But another thing before I, go is, Brett Leonard in, the documentary in Cyber God, one of the things that he was talking about is, a lot of the stuff that they made specifically for the movie, he's, come to realize that in real life, they've actually started to, develop stuff like that in real life, like stuff that was made specifically for the movie to convey, interacting with virtual reality, like the chairs that Job and Peter, are in when, they're playing the virtual reality flight game. In real life now, there are, contraptions like that. I mean, they're probably a lot more refined, but, Brett Leonard was talking about that. He's like, he remembers, they were kind of improvising and, just kind of throwing stuff together, to make it look, sort of ramshackle and high tech at the same time, but now, though, there are actually, contraptions that allow for stuff like that. And so, I mean, 1992, I mean, the movie was supposed to take place in the near future, and it was made in 1992, but, stuff that was made for the movie, I mean, to make it look like, they were actually interacting with virtual reality, in real life, some of this stuff's come to pass. And so I thought that was actually pretty neat to see, art imitating life or life imitating art, So yeah, Lawnmower Man, 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good movie, so thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. If you got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all take care, have a good night, bye.